Welcome to the Bound to Be Rich podcast, where I attempt to reverse engineer people who seem to be successful no matter the circumstances so that you can apply those lessons to your life. I'm your host, Ismail Himet. In this episode, we are joined by Nicholas Rhodes, the founder of OutSnapped, a major photo booth company in New York City. Nicholas started snapping photos at parties and somehow translated that into shooting for major publications like Rolling Stone magazine and big name celebrities. We even get into some cool anecdotes about how Lady Gaga and Steve Aoki were able to get Nick's attention before they were famous. Lady Gaga in particular had some very impressive marketing tactics. Nick is now the king of virtual and having incredible success by pivoting into virtual booths. I don't think there's anyone in the world that has spent more time personally pitching virtual booths to big brands than Nick. We even discuss a recent example of working with Netflix. As an event company, how did he manage to do better than last year in a world with no in-person events? What has he learned from his journey and from selling to big brands? Let's dive in. Nicholas, thanks for joining us. Welcome to the show.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me. Pretty excited that you started this up.
Yeah, appreciate your support as always. For people who don't know the story behind OutSnapped and how it began, can you tell us, how'd you get into the event industry? What were you doing before OutSnapped, basically?
Yeah, so for about a decade before launching OutSnap, actually closer to 15 years, I ran a company out of New York City, which was called NikkiDigital.com. And it started initially as taking photos of nightlife and events, and eventually became a full-fledged event production company. So a lot of the tools that we actually use for OutSnap, we built and designed to create marketing opportunities to sell tickets to future events for my company, Nikki Digital, and also our clients.
And I think this was in the early days of the blogging, internet, online stuff. You were kind of a trailblazer in New York City for the event scene. Is that right? Where you were kind of humble about, oh, you're just taking pictures at events, but you were doing some big ones with celebrities. Is there any ones that you'd care to share?
Well, there are countless celebrities, but I think what was more interesting is just the time. You know, if you think back to the early 2000s, it was very difficult to take a photo and put it on the internet. And as a result of being able to do that, it opened up a lot of doors for me. So I was able to go to an event, take photos, and post them on the internet before other people were able to access photos. You know, we take it for granted right now because every single person has a really good camera in their pocket all the time with an iPhone or an Android. But back then, literally, you had to take photos on film, develop them, scan them, and then upload them. It was a very long process. Like for those of you who are old enough to remember like Friendster and MySpace days, you remember how hard it was to put a photo up there.
Yeah, for sure.
So we really cut our teeth on that. And like I said, I love music, and there's just not enough time to do everything. So photography was actually supposed to be my hobby. At the time that I launched Nikki Digital, it was just a personal blog, and I was working full time as an art director in print design at magazines, believe it or not. So I worked at a bunch of titles ranging from Radar Magazine to Us Weekly to Rolling Stone, and kind of bounced around. And it was a really interesting time in the early 2000s because I was fresh out of college and really excited to work in print. And pretty much everyone else was really excited about the internet. Not that I wasn't excited about the internet because I was doing it on my own time, but I had just gone through 4 years of school at Emerson with a media and a major that they were at the time calling new media, which was essentially Internet 101, where we specialized in putting red text on black background. Essentially, that's like an old internet joke for those of you who remember. Yeah, by the time I graduated, I was so sick of looking for missing semicolons in code that I really wanted to take my learnings and do editorial design, which if you look at the way web design has really gone in terms of, newspapers, like New York Times is a fantastic example of how editorial design and UX really are very similar to printed media. So I think that was an interesting thing for me because I saw the parallels back then, and I was really excited to work in a static environment where I was taking my learnings from designing for the internet and actually putting them on paper.
You mentioned that it was really cumbersome to put those images online back then.
Yep.
What made you do that then? What opportunity did you see to make you say, "Hey, I'm going to take all this time scanning and uploading these online"?
Well, the thing that made it possible for me was I had a digital camera at that point. So I had gone to Emerson where I was a double major in new media and photography. And the photography department there, because of my major, allowed me to do a lot of digital work. So I did a lot of darkroom time, but I also really dabbled with early, inkjet printing, plissé printing, and also Photoshop stuff. So I was shooting at that point either on film or digital, or creating graphics in a digital environment and then bringing them into the darkroom. So really kind of mixing the two worlds. So I was building essentially negatives in Photoshop, exporting them on, printing them on clear materials, and then I don't want to say dockering, but enhancing the photos with those grayscale images that I was printing. So there was a lot of like back and forth for me at that point. I would share some of the work, but it's pretty embarrassing to go back and look at it 20 some odd years later. But nonetheless, it really allowed me to sort of have one foot in both worlds. And I think that's something that's really helped me moving forward, is really understanding how different mediums and different types of tech and people can all kind of work together, right? So it's like, how do you figure out the tool that's right for this particular thing? And I think that that's something that's always made me really, I don't want to use the word successful, but lucky to be able to problem.
Well, that's something that I'd love to have you expand on. Is from what I know of your story, you seem to follow your passions, right? So you were operating at the intersection of photography, technology, and music, and I assume that's because you were passionate about those things, right? But one thing people really struggle with when you speak to everyone that's aspiring to do something, that they have a passion. Let's say as a photographer, they love doing it; it's their hobby, and converting that into income or a business or something is very difficult. So from your experience, do you have any advice on how to like take your passion and earn a living from it? Like even with the blog on Nikki Digital, not a lot of people have figured out how to earn a living on blogs back then.
Yeah, and this is something you and I have talked a lot about this year, especially, is just trying to figure it out. And I think that goes back to what I was just saying about, it's really like, people think of being creative as having like an easel and paints and painting a beautiful portrait or a landscape, but I really think of creativity as problem solving. And that's why I think like a lot of people who are really good at science or math or any real academia are also really good at problem solving as well, and therefore are often more creative than people give them credit for. Like if you think about the way we've developed really anything, it's like problem solving, right? So you have a goal that you want to get to, and like sometimes the goal is as simple as like, I need to figure out how to pay rent this month, right? And something I always joke about is like, I'm never picking up the phone to call out unless I can't pay rent, and then I pick up the phone and I pay rent, right? Like that's the problem solving. So with Nikki Digital, what I was initially solving for was being a young 20 something in New York City who had an entry level job, who was paying for an apartment and really loved music, but couldn't afford to go out 6 or 7 nights a week, right? So the camera for me was a way to essentially get free tickets and free entree into these events. And then it wasn't really until 2008-ish when I had made some money off of it, but it wasn't until 2008-ish when the magazine that I was the art director of went belly up pretty unexpectedly. And I had to figure out how to make a living. And what was different this time, I had been at a few startup magazines that had failed before, but what was different this time was that the economic crisis had just set in and everybody was trying to figure out how to lay people off. So there was no way to get a job. And literally, I always joke that in the magazine, the print media world, they like still have not started hiring art directors in 2000. So the teams went from like a magazine team at a small magazine was 30, 40 people minimum. And now they're down to like, 10 people making printed magazines. It's pretty crazy. So what I had to do in 2008 was figure out how to make rent. So I figured out how to monetize what had become my hobby. And at that time, there was no line item for paying photographers in nightlife. And talking to the managers in the clubs who were really on the ground with me, seeing that I was bringing people to the events because of the photography, I was able to work out deals on headcount. So I got paid per person who showed up and kind of accidentally became a nightclub promoter.
That's the definition of an entrepreneur. But I'm curious, like you have your passion, you're at these events, right? And you're trying to figure out how do I make money from doing this. Did you approach those managers or did they ask you, hey, you're bringing people, maybe we should work out a deal? How did that start?
you know, those were nights many, many years ago that were often hazy. And I don't recall which came first, the chicken or the egg. But I do imagine that, like I just said, I hate picking up the phone. It is one of the hardest things for me to do, to pick up the phone and ask for work. but when you need to, you need to. So I imagine it was probably me being like, hey, I just got laid off. If you want me to keep bringing people to your club, we need to figure this out. And I think actually, now that I'm thinking about it, I think that maybe I had started getting offers from other clubs that I wasn't wanting to be at. And
Mm.
I think I was able to go back and say, like, hey, this is where I want to be on a Friday night, but this other club is offering me.
And then how did this all pivot into a photo booth company?
Good question. So, similarly, as you get older, you tend to need more money, like nicer furniture or better food, etc. And as a result, you need to figure out how to make more money. And so, like I had said a minute ago, there was really no line item for what I was doing. And I didn't want to be getting paid on a head count because when you're getting paid on a head count, you either have to lie to people and tell them it's going to be an amazing night, or you need to have a team that's also doing their job to create something that's easier to sell, right? So, like in New York City, there's this is not an exaggeration, probably. Well, now during COVID, there's probably not, but there are thousands and thousands of opportunities for every single person to do every moment of the day in New York. So to be able to get someone to go to a specific location, it has to be based on the quality of the experience, right? So if you're working with a team that's producing good quality experiences, and this, obviously parlays into experiential work and marketing as well, the better the experience, the more that people want to participate. So what I was starting to realize was that some of the clubs that I was working with were not providing the types of entertainment that I needed to bring people to those events without essentially lying. And as you know, in sales, if you sell something that doesn't exist, the greatest modern example of this is the Fire Festival. If you sell something that doesn't exist, people don't buy it again, right? So when you're working in the entertainment industry, if you're trying to get people to come and experience something with you, that experience has to be worth it. So what I realized was that I could start producing events to make sure that they were worth attending. And then I would also be the one controlling the budget. So that way I was no longer getting paid on a head count. Overall, I guess I was because I was getting paid on the success of the event. But then I was actually making money in my head more on my passion versus me saying, okay, I just need to get 20 people on the door tonight, like beg, steal, and borrow stuff. Right? And that was not a way I liked working. And so once I started creating events and partnering with the nightclubs that I was working with on a larger level to create the experiences, I was able to book talent from around the world. And you also have to remember like this stuff was very, I don't want to say easy, but it was easier back then because the internet was a smaller place. And realizing that what I realized was that the internet has millions of these celebrities that literally no one knows about. So it's like a very different world than celebrity predating the internet and then early internet celebrity. I ended up being kind of what they called before influencers personal brand. So any musician who was coming through New York City really wanted to meet me and do things with me because I was getting on average like 200,000 page views a day on Nikki Digital. And really coming from the major market cities like New York, LA, Milan, Rome, Paris, like the places where people went for vibrant nightlife experiences. And so it was also a very unique time in the music world where indie music, which I really love, and dance music, which I also really love, converged. And we got this genre, which was, as you can guess, called indie dance. But it was something that I really liked. And it also happened to be a lot of people in my age bracket who were very active on the internet. So we had lots of communities on the internet where we got to know each other. And it would open up these amazing doors. Like I would go to Helsinki and just post a message on this, message board saying, hey, I'm going to Helsinki. Does anyone know anyone there that I should meet? And then all of a sudden, my entire week in Helsinki was taken care of because the people who were doing the equivalent in Helsinki of what I was doing in New York would plan the week for me, take me to all the best nightclubs, take me to the best concerts, introduce me to the most talented artists. And it was really amazing. It was this community that existed on the internet and then back into real life.
So a couple questions based on what you just said before we dive into OutSnapped that I have to bring up. You mentioned the personal brand, right? And for people who don't know, you have a really cool mustache, right? Can you talk a little bit about how to successfully build a personal brand, even for someone like me who's trying to build a podcast or whatever? How, in this day and age where everyone's really interested in doing stuff online, do you recommend building a personal brand?
Yeah, I think there's a major difference now than then, and that's kind of what I was talking about with like the idea of a micro celebrity having millions of followers versus then a macro celebrity on the internet, someone like myself having like 100,000 followers, right? Like I have about 30,000 followers on Instagram, which right now is like Bubkiss, but back then that was huge, right? And so now you're seeing a monkey opening presents having millions of followers, and that's content that someone might interact with for a day or 2 days and come back to and send it around like meme style. But that person can't move a needle more likely than not. So like if that monkey were to take up a cause and be like monkeys for, climate science, everyone would be like, cool, monkey, go back to opening presents, right? Um, like we're here just to see the one thing that you do. And sorry to pick on this monkey. I got to look up its name because it really
Poor
is worth
George.
it is worth 30 minutes of your time, but not more.
I'll
But
put a link in the show notes if you send it to me.
but what I'm saying is like back then, as someone who had this kind of like it was a community. So like I wouldn't call it celebrity. It was like a tight knit community that because there was enough people involved in it, you really could move the needle, right? So it's like any three or four of these people pairing up to do something, like for instance, my trip to Helsinki, I get there and this network puts together this thing for me to do, right? And because the network stands for me, then everyone in their network is excited to come to a party, have their photos taken by a photographer from New York. And then that opens up a whole new network for me because now I have people in Helsinki checking out my website on a more regular basis. Just like if someone like myself or a DJ had come from Helsinki, New York. And actually, I'm harping on Helsinki because I did go there one time and had this absolutely amazing trip and this very unique moment that I'll tell you about. We may have talked about this before, but obviously not on the podcast. I was in the DJ booth and one of the DJs or promoters asked me if I was having a good time, and I was like, "Yeah, I'm having a great time." I was like, "I'm just really surprised how much this is like New York." And that was when I started to realize that the internet had really started to make the communities grow internationally. So we used to, as a kid, when I went to Europe, you would go and the fashion would be different from city to city and definitely different than in America, right? And now you go almost anywhere in the world I've been post the internet, post 2010, and everyone has the same fashion trends, everyone has the same look and feel. People are excited about the same music because there's no real boundaries, like, which is good and bad. But so I was in this DJ booth and I made that comment, and the DJ was like, "Yeah, well, I mean, of course, but like you have to realize that the DJ that's playing this song right now is from Helsinki and this is his song." And I was like, "Oh, wait, like we're doing the same thing because this song is actually really big in New York too." So like we're co-opting the things that we're picking up from around the world. So in terms of that, this is sort of like a roundabout way of saying like when I was doing it, all you really had to do was like follow the if you build it, they will come model because the internet was so small, right? So I was able to create a community because I was one of the few people who could publish on the internet.
Well, the whole
I
system's kind of like hardwired to enable sharing and social media. Like all the infrastructure
Sure,
kind of changed to enable the globalization of things online. So that made it a lot easier.
sure. And
Um,
I well, and going back to the monkey and current times and like what you were asking, I think that it's a lot easier now to get known for one thing on the internet. So like if your thing is like when you should buy and sell a certain type of stock or if you should, like how to pivot, I think those are the things people will tune in. And it's like you look at someone like Gary Vee who really can talk about anything, but all he's really saying is like get up and do it. Stop complaining, right? And that's that same message over and over and over and over again. And like hard work begets more work. Like that's his message. And he can sugarcoat it, candy coat it, tell it any different way, write a different book about it. But that's the message from the beginning to the end, right? So if Gary were to start talking about something else, like, hey, I'm Gary.
cooking.
I no longer care about your ability to get the job done. Now I want to like save the earth. Everyone's gonna be like, yeah, not for me. Who's the next guy who can like give me my motivational speech in the morning?
Why do you still have the mustache?
Okay, so the mustache. The reason the mustache came about was initially back in 2000 and I think 2007. I was out one night and there was a poster of a guy from the circus with a big ringleader mustache. And they looked at the woman I was dating at the time and I was like, wouldn't it be funny if I grew that mustache? And she was like, it would absolutely not be funny if you grew that mustache. And
And that's why
then
you did it.
And then fast forward about 3 months later, we had this very like I don't think you can do the kind of breakup we had as true adults. We had this miscommunication breakup where she had thought I had done something. I hadn't done the thing that she thought I was. And we couldn't communicate about it because every time I was like, I don't know what you're talking about. She was like, I can't believe you're denying knowing what I'm talking about. And we ended up having this very confusing breakup. And as a result, I was like, I'm going to grow that mustache just to show her
There you go.
how heartbroken I am that we broke up. And later found out 6 months later that the thing that was the wedge between us was actually a devious person who had lied about something that wasn't true and was horrible. So it really seemed like I was pretending that I didn't know what I was talking about. So that's how the mustache got there. But what I realized was that people started noticing me by the mustache, and especially nightclub bouncers. So if I was showing up at a nightclub and didn't want to wait in line, they would recognize me. They'd be like, "Hey, mustache, why are you waiting in line?" They didn't know my name. They just knew I worked in the nightclub. And with something like this on your face, people make fun of you, but then you also have the pros of, "Hey, mustache, I'm making fun of you, but cut the entire line." And you're like, "Okay, well, that seems like a good deal." And then I also started realizing that people in the nightclubs were really recognizing who I was. And that's when I started branding our stickers and our merch and our website around essentially my face, which at the time seemed like an amazing idea because I wanted people to recognize me to open those doors, but ultimately led to the reason why Nikki Digital itself couldn't scale because it was a brand
Hmm.
built around me, which as a young person who needed those ego boosts made a lot of sense. But as I started to get older and wanted to run more of a business as opposed to being more of a kid in the nightclubs having a good time and also earning a living, um, I couldn't scale because every time I sent someone else out, people were like, "Wait, why isn't Nikki here?"
Where's mustache?
Yeah, exactly. Where's the guy with the mustache?
I mean, I think there are pros and cons to building a business on a personal brand and doing it something that's not as personal. So everyone's got to decide what they want to do for themselves. There are probably some instances where it makes sense, some where it doesn't. And this is probably a vain question, but I feel like people are so curious about it. So I'll just ask,
Yeah.
what is it like working with all these mega celebrities? And I think there are a couple names that I know, like Lady Gaga, Aoki, and I'm sure there's plenty more. What's it like working with them? Is there any cool story or anecdote you can share? And how do you get to work with them?
Celebrity is a weird thing. Um, and with the group that you listed just now, um, you have to remember that there was a time when I was more famous than those people. And that sounds like an asshole thing to say, but I was not like an A-list celebrity. I was just a person in New York City who was an important connector. And these people came to New York City and wanted something. They wanted fame, right?
Right. And Lady Gaga started her career in small clubs in the city for those who don't know. Yeah.
Lady Gaga started her career in a bar that's like 2 blocks from where I live. And Lady Gaga, there's a whole really interesting story about Lady Gaga too that I can get in if we have time. But what it's like working with those people is the ones that are really awesome don't forget that you help them give you their start, and they check in on you from time to time. The other ones do not do that, and it's like you'll bump into someone who you spent a million days with, and you'll bump into them in another city and they cannot place you. I've had a lot of friends go from being minor celebrities here in New York City to being very, very large musician traveling acts, and it's very interesting to see how fame and celebrity pays a toll on people. And a lot of it, it's not really, it's a lot of people think it's ego, and there's definitely part of that. Like, in order to become a celebrity, you really need to have that thing that's like the willing to step on other people to make sure you are the best at what you do. And to be a celebrity, you're essentially just an entertainer. The time you leave your apartment to the time you come back in, right? You have to smile at everyone on the street. And there are some celebrities who stay out of the limelight, but for the most part, you have to be prepared to present in that way all the time. And that's really tiring. As someone who did what I did and was not an international celebrity, or was not a celebrity outside of New York City, but I couldn't walk around the streets of New York City without having to have conversations with people, whether it's bar owners or club owners, or just someone on the street who wanted to know what the next cool thing was. It's really tiring to always be turned on. And that was one of the things ultimately that made me want to get away from what I was doing with Nikki. I didn't want to be out 6 nights a week, keeping up the line of business. I didn't want to keep up that smile. I wanted to be able to have a grumpy day.
How did you get to work with people like that?
Well, so at first it was that people were coming to New York. Like, for instance, Steve Aoki. Um, People have differing opinions on Steve. Steve is one of the hardest working people that I've ever met in my life. And he approached DJing and the nightlife world as a real business person. And he made investments in himself and his career early on based on what he thought he had to do to become a national DJ name, now international, right? One of the biggest names in the game. And one of the things he would do was he would fly himself to different cities. He obviously had the means to do so, but he would fly himself to different cities and say, "Hey, I see you have a really amazing party. I would like to play your party. You don't have to pay me. I'm going to fly myself there. But your party looks amazing. Like, let's do it." And we would say, like, "Sure, guy from LA. Like, what, can you send us some music so we can check it out first?" You know? And Steve came to New York, and like one of the earliest parties he played was my birthday party one year, and we had an amazing time. And now I have no idea how many hundreds of thousands of dollars he gets to play the nightclubs in Vegas, etc. But Steve is one of the nicest dudes who always has time for his fans. And but I think people forget how tiring it is. Like, most people, when they travel, they get on an airplane to go to a place they're excited to be. And when you start in that world, like, I was touring with musicians and also doing a lot of music festival tours. And one year, I think I did 27 music festivals, which puts me out of my home for essentially half of the year. And the first few weeks are amazing, right? And then you realize that you're getting on the plane, do a thing that you just did the last weekend, and it's just sort of this like rinse and repeat cycle. So at the beginning, it's really exciting. It's like going to sleepaway camp with your best friends. You like get to this festival, you bump into Steve or another person, you have some beers, you hang out, you talk about the week. And then by the end of the year, it's like you get off the plane, you try and sleep a little bit, you go to the festival, you stay up working, try and sleep a little bit, you go to the festival, and it's just this like kind of vicious cycle. So what I always joke about is when people have these like daydreams and fantasies, no one ever tells you about the nightmare parts of them that you're not supposed to wish in. So it's like, if you ever want to wish for these things, it's like, I would like to be a famous musician who has 36 hours in the day, so I'm always well slept. It's like, those are the things, or like constantly being running from the gig to the airport. It's
Mm.
not a very it's not as cool a lifestyle as some may see.
It still must have been like I would have found it fascinating to be around people before they made it like huge and see what lessons I could take from it. Like you said, Yaoki was really investing in himself for the long term. He wasn't really worried about making money short term or maximizing his money short term. He's just trying to get better and better. And that's how I guess people get to the level where they're making hundreds of thousands of dollars per gig. You do some for free in the beginning to up your game, right?
Yeah, yes and no. I think he is a unique case. And I mean, his original DJ name was Kid Millionaire, and that kind of like puts it in context, right? So like, everyone knows if you have money, you can make money. I do like to make a distinction with Steve though, because he was really smart, and I don't want to say narrow-minded. He just had his mind, like his eye on the goal, and he executed a plan versus just like being a rich kid. And looking at some other people in the world, like, it's not about. I don't think anyone should work for free to get somewhere, but you do have to cut your teeth, right? Like, one of my absolute best friends was a partner of mine in many events. So I worked with him for 10 years before he started getting national notoriety. He had always been a DJ's DJ, but it wasn't until just like sort of, the time was right for him. And now he's a national name, he and his partner. They DJ the best festivals. They're one of the best selling artists, but literally 10 years of just slogging it out. And I always complain to him because he's a true DJ in the sense that he can read a room. Like a really good wedding DJ can read a room and play the music that the room wants to hear, right? And back in nightclubs, it used to be like that. The DJ would not be the center of attention, and the DJ would look at the room and figure out two things. One, how to make the room dance, and two, how to make the room buy drink, right? And that's why you have the arc and flow of a night. Because a lot of the times the DJs were working for the promoter, and the promoter was the one with the nightclub, connection, and then promoter made money based off of how the bar did, right? So the DJ had to keep the crowd happy and also his boss happy. You have to know on which side your bread is buttered. And now when you go and see a show, it's more about a hard ticket versus bar sales. So the bar now will spend 50,000 plus on a DJ, make their money back on, sorry, not the bar, that's more of a larger club. Will spend that money on the DJ and make their money back on the bottle service and the bar service, right? They're not necessarily cutting out those percentages anymore. And the people are buying the ticket, which pays for the talent to come in. And the talent is there based on whatever fame or notoriety that they have. So the crowd that comes wants to hear them play a set that's more akin to going and seeing a band play. So now DJs will go and play an hour of their music kind of from start to finish versus playing to the crowd. The crowd is there for the DJ. So it's become a very different paradigm in the US of what role of the disc jockey is, the DJ.
Since you mentioned it, I have to ask, otherwise people will yell at me in the comments. It's the Lady Gaga story.
Okay, so what do you want to know about Lady Gaga?
Well, you mentioned that you had a cool story earlier about her.
Oh,
so.
yeah. So
Yeah.
Lady Gaga, the way I found out about Lady Gaga was that for those of you who are on original MySpace, there used to be what was called the top 8, which eventually became the top 15. But when it was still the top 8, it was the 8 people that you were friends with who had been on MySpace the longest. One of the biggest changes MySpace ever made was allowing you to pick who was in your top 8. And it sort of became this like micro networking. So in my top 8, I would put my best friends, also my closest nightlife colleagues, and that's how we ran our businesses out of the message boards on MySpace. I would post that I was going to be at XYZ nightclub tonight. So one day I had at that point, all of the advertising on Nikki Digital was run through a site called AdRoll, if I remember correctly. And then Google AdSense was pretty new. And it was a way to essentially have Google sell the advertising on your pages. And now we see it all the time. You go to a website and in the blink of an eye, there's all these micro conversions and micro biddings on buying the time in front of your eye based on your demographic information. This was predated that. So anyone could buy direct on a website that was on any of these platforms. So all of a sudden one day, all of the ad space on my website was bought by this Lady Gaga person. And I was like, that is cool. I don't know who this person is. And then the next day it was all Lady Gaga stuff. And then the day after that, it was all Lady Gaga stuff. And that's when I started to realize it wasn't necessarily an accident. And then I went to figure out who she was. And back then you searched MySpace as opposed to Google to find out about who people were. And I was like, huh, Lady Gaga. And I was in her top 8. And I was like, that's very strange. Who is Lady Gaga? And then it turned out that it was this girl, Stephanie, that we did know from the nightlife world. But the reality was once she started working with a major label, that was a big part of their play. And this is back in, I don't know, I'd have to look, but probably 2008 or 9. They were already playing the social media card in this very strategic chess way, right? So someone would see this Lady Gaga thing, go to her profile and be like, oh, she's really good friends with Nick. I should check her out. And I had no idea who she was.
Wow. That
Right?
that is, but that wasn't necessarily her doing. It was the label's
It
strategy to do it.
it may have been both because I don't know, but it was smart. It definitely helped, and it launched her in a way that gave her cred from the very beginning.
Wow, that's really cool. That's like sneaky ninja guerrilla marketing tactic. A lot of lessons to be taken from that. That's really interesting. I didn't know that story.
Yeah, but one thing that is really cool about Steph is that she has always taken care of the people who were there for her in the beginning. A lot of the people that were in that friend group, which was sort of one or two friend groups removed from me, she was in more of the rock and roller kind of nightlife scene, which ironically I wouldn't say she is now. I think she's more on the electro side, but there were a lot of musicians in that crowd that she still supports today. Like there was a jazz trumpet player that when she toured with what was his name? Oh, Tony Bennett, and took our friend Brian out on tour with her to play lead trumpet, and was constantly doing things like that for the community that she came out of. So I think that's really incredible. And as a result, there were a handful of times that I got to work with her after she was very famous. One of them being most notably the bar that she had kind of gotten her start in had changed hands a few times, but had always sort of become this place that she could go back to and could be taken care of in a way that it wasn't about celebrity. It was about being a regular person. And there was one night that she and Brian and a handful of others did this pop up jazz concert in the back. And it's like one of those unforgettable New York City nights where, to a room of like 25 people in the back room of this nightclub, they did an hour of jazz standards and it was incredible, and super fun. And I was tapped to photograph it. And then her team seeded those, to the tabloids, etc. So it was really fun.
That's awesome. I'm sure there's a ton of stories that you'd have. Maybe I'll pepper you offline. But bringing it back to OutSnapped, um, this is something I always talk about because when I mention photo booth company to like friends and family, people kind of think of it. Oh, that's cute. That's cool. You got that at the parties. Can you take us to the beginning of 2020 before the pandemic, OutSnapped, and give us an idea of how big a photo booth company can get, or like give us a sense for how successful OutSnapped was?
Yeah, that's a tough question. I think the word success means so many different things to so many people. Um, I think of success in a few different ways. Obviously, the easy one is money, right? Like, what's your P&L look like? Because that's the one that everyone else determines. But for me, what is really successful is the ratio of how many times a year you stop and go, "Holy shit, that was really cool. I'm really proud of us for doing that." And I think that's my main motivator. Like money, of course, yes. That's like I said, that's what gets me on the phone. Got to put food on the table. But the thing that really keeps me going is that like moment where you're like, oh wow, we just pulled off something crazy, right? Um, and that to me is my true success metric. And without Snap, it's hard to say when it like truly started and when Nikki Digital truly ended. But on paper, it's January of 2017. OutSnap officially became an LLC, and when we started shifting business over. And the initially my concept was that we had built all these tools for myself. I was not wanting to be out multiple nights a week anymore, and changing that lifestyle was also another success metric for me. When I no longer had to be out 6 nights a week, could keep food on the table, and could feel cool about what we were doing. And with Nikki Digital, the success metric I didn't realize at the beginning was really about relevance and the desire to stay relevant became less than the need to stay relevant to sustain that business model successfully. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, often the metrics people point to, and I'll just throw some out from what I've seen. I know OutSnap's one of the biggest photo booth companies in the city, which is saying something because it's very competitive out here. You've got a large location at the Brooklyn Navy Yards, and I know the kind of events that you work. So um, I think those are the metrics people generally point to. But I definitely hear what you're saying, that you want to look back at your year and be like, "Wow, I had a lot of those great moments."
But if
Um,
you think about it, that's intrinsically built into my business model, right? So as opposed to being the person who's like, hey, I just need to make a lot of money, I'm seeking out opportunities that will make me proud of what we're doing and thus put us, I believe, in a slightly different lane on the freeway as our competition, if that makes sense.
so that reminds me of a question I had. I'm glad you brought that up because from what I know of you, you don't it seems like every opportunity that you get, you like to operate in the premium sandbox. You like to play in the higher level, right? As opposed to taking on things that you don't necessarily enjoy, you don't find cool. I'm sure you do some of that, obviously to pay the bills, but you tend to lean more in the premium area, the upper end. Can you tell me a little bit about the mentality there? Why do you do that? Is it conscious? Is it
Yeah.
just
Okay.
yeah?
That's interesting because that kind of goes back to what I was saying about why I opted to eventually sunset Nikki Digital and really make it just a personal project again. So much of what was important about running that business was staying cool. And the definition of cool changes by the second, right? So I was in this hamster wheel of having to stay relevant all the time. So before I made any decision, the metric of deciding whether or not to make that decision was, would other people think this is cool, right? And that meant ultimately making decisions sometimes where I knew it was a bad business decision for the company because it ultimately would have negative long term results, but we needed the cash infusion, right? So when I started the new business, I went into this thinking like, okay, we're going to have different lines of work, right? You sort of have your premium model, and then you have your mid tier and you have your low tier. And I thought that we would really be focusing on wedding, weddings, bar mitzvahs, small things like that, because that was a market that we hadn't been in. And naively, I was like, that's just going to be so much easier than dealing with all these like high stress corporate events, right? We'll just go and do a wedding, we'll take our money. What I didn't realize was that when we do these high end corporate events, yes, they're high stress, but it's 99% of the times they're real professionals running these things and they run mostly as they're supposed to. When we started doing weddings, the profit margins were initially where I thought we wanted them to be, but then the amount of work it would take to get to and from this wedding was just like, from the time of booking to the time that the wedding ended was just astronomically different than I imagined. So, we'll have a perfect example. We did a wedding like 2 years ago. A bride emails me at the middle of COVID, early middle of COVID, saying, "Hey, we bought a hardcover coffee table book from you, and we just realized that there's a typo on it." And I said, "Oh, great to hear from you. I hope you're doing, well and good the during COVID." And she goes, "How soon until you can replace this book?" Like no pleasantries at all, right? And I said, "Well, we'd be more than happy to replace the book for you. The cost is X." And she goes, "Why do we have to pay for it?" And I said, "Well, we cut and paste everything that is in that book from the questionnaire you sent us. So if there's a typo, it would be your mistake. We no longer have your book. So we'd have to get the files, rebuild it, and redo everything for you." And that's the kind of mentality that it always seemed to be with these smaller events. It was not people who were in the professional world who knew that once an event happened, it had its sort of window. Like we could have made good on that, whether it was our fault or not, a few weeks after, because everything is still able, it would have taken us 10 minutes and $100 versus the cost of goods plus 2 or 3 hours to rebuild it. But she didn't realize that she was not the only thing I was doing that day. And that kept being that way with a lot of our clients. So now, ironically, in the virtual space, we're feeling that a lot because a lot of the folks that we're dealing with on some of the smaller side events, the office events, these people have never planned a virtual event before. So they're calling me up being like, their head's on fire because they're trying to manage this virtual event that they didn't really put time and energy into because they thought it'd be easy because it wasn't an in-person event. And they're saying, "We need this thing right now. We need it right now. We need it right now." And I calmly say like, "Hey, that's why we have a 7-day period on this. That's why you were supposed to get it to us on this date. And that's why, we're doing the best we can to accommodate you. But I completely understand how you're feeling because I'm managing 25 other people like you this morning, right?" I don't say that to the client, but that's what's going on in my head of like, yes, now I too am freaking out because you waited to the last second. So I think it's really about, I lost my train of thought on this. Reel me back in. Where were
Playing
we?
in the premium. So to
Oh,
me,
yeah, yeah.
the irony is that um, people don't think that they can operate at the premium end or the high end, but it ends up there's like less competition there, right? And generally
Yeah.
speaking, like you said, the work, I don't want to say the work is easier because it's
No,
not, but there's more professionals working there. It's just a different level and
yeah.
it's
And
less competition.
think about it like any other experience you do, right? So much of what I was talking about getting a Christmas tree with my sister, and I was like, "Oh yeah, I'm gonna probably leave the city to get it because I think it'll be cheaper." And the guys who normally sell me my Christmas tree are not on my corner this year. Like I was gonna support them, but if they're not here, I have no allegiance to anyone else. And if I have to get in the car, I may as well, drive and make a day of it versus, drive uptown to get a tree. And she said, "Well, you may be surprised. We just got a tree and it was really expensive locally." And I was like, "Oh, why?" And she goes, "I don't know." And I said, "Well, tell me about the day." She goes, "Well, we got there, we parked, we were shown where to park, we got out of the car, we were immediately given hot cocoa, taken to a place where they told us all about the experience that was about to happen. One person walked with us and helped us find the perfect tree for us. They let my niece and nephew, her daughter and son, try and cut the tree down for a second. Then my husband did it for a second, and then ultimately this guy finished it off, carried the tree back down, wrapped it up, put it on the top of the car, and then we left. Right? And I was like, okay, so what you actually paid for was a full day experience, right? So if you think about the premium versus the what we call rinse and repeat or low hanging fruit, you're paying for that white glove service. You're not paying just for the product that you get because time is money. When we do cost of goods, my time internally, it's not my time. I put at 250 an hour just because that's what, as a photographer, I got. So in my head, that's still what I think I'm worth. That changes a lot, especially now that the organization of the business has changed a lot. Back in March pre-COVID, we had 13 people on the team, and now we have me and some part-timers, and then devs when we need, and um, I have a graphic designer that I brought on for freelance projects because I'm too busy to handle right now. So I don't think my hourly rate is still that, but that's still like where my head thinks. So when I do a project with someone, if I'm going to spend 40 hours on it, I got to get 40 times 250 plus cost of goods to break even, if that makes sense. Also, like, with sales, which is really new to me, like prior to COVID, obviously we did sales, but we did them very differently. We've been very lucky to work in a referral pool. And what that means is by the time someone got on the phone with us, they were already a very warm lead and were likely to want to buy, right? So people would come to us when they were like, hey, we have this concept where we want to turn a phone booth into a photo booth with a one-way mirror so we can see into the phone booth, but they can't see out of the phone booth. And the reason they got us is because they had probably called two or three other event producers before landing on my phone line, or maybe even another photo booth company was like, hey, we don't do that, but call OutSnapped, they'll do that, right? So by the time they got us on the phone, they were already a warm lead. And then the sales process was the white glove service of talking to them about it, really understanding what their goals were, what their KPIs were about the project, and figuring out problem solving, going back to that creativity at the time. So I'd be on the phone problem solving with them to figure out how we were going to achieve their goal, whether it was just the build and it was just about a fun activity for a bar or bot, or if there was a real marketing reason why this thing was a phone booth, what the experience was going to be, why it was going to be, and ultimately what was going to make their boss happy that they work with us, right? So that's what goes into the premium model.
I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about how you think about competition because you know the saying people say if you can make it in New York, you can make it anywhere. We kind of alluded to how many events there are going on in the city, how many people there are. There's so much competition. I imagine if you started a photo booth company somewhere else, it'd be a lot easier for you to succeed. How do you think about competing? Because people are always complaining, I'm losing business to lower cost competitors and stuff like that. So, what's your mindset on it?
Yeah, I think it goes back to sort of some of the examples I've shared with you, just in the sense that it's hard to say. It's hard to say what it would be like to work in different major markets. There's really big players in the scene that we all know, like LA Photo Party is probably the biggest one nationally, I would say, maybe Bosco. And those folks are doing a ton of work. They're doing quality and
I mean, there's a ton of people that are
yeah,
out there doing it. How do you beat them?
nationally in those major markets, New York, Chicago, Austin, probably, LA, there is enough work for everyone, period, end of story, right? Like there literally could not be too many photo booth companies in New York City. Maybe not during COVID, obviously, but there literally couldn't. Now with virtual space, literally everybody is in every single market, right? Like one of the things that's been so cool for me is about waking up and my first call of the day will be with someone in Europe and my last call of the day will be with someone in Asia. And it's like literally like the globe follows my schedule or I follow their schedule, probably a more humble way to say it, but it's been really cool. So now I think more than ever, there's opportunity for people to do things at all the different price points, right? Like we have no shortage of people hitting us up for $300 photo booths, virtual photo booths, right? So the cost of goods on a photo booth may still provide profit, but I don't know if you remember what I said in my head is my hourly rate is 250. So if I'm having an hour long phone call with someone to sell them a $300 photo booth, I've already lost money. So we're doing less of that right now that we're very confident in our product. and we're focusing more again on those higher tier. They don't tend to be, they're higher tier price points because they're higher tier projects. That makes sense, right? So we'll have someone come to us and say, "Hey, we have this TV premiere, this premiere, and we built a website for it, and we don't want people to notice that they're leaving our website to use your photo booth." So now instead of saying, "Okay, well, our photo booth costs X," what you're asking is going to take like 40 hours of dev time probably. So now this project we have to charge this to even break even on it, right? And those are really interesting conversations to have with someone who's not used to event production or used to the concept of building for the internet, because people have really been trained to think that the internet is a free place to play. And the internet mostly is a free place to play because you're paying for it with your demographic information that then sells ads to you. But there's a real cost of goods involved in each session, the amount of time and energy that it goes into building each of these things. And yeah, so I think like we're shifting back into that lane where I'm turning down projects that I'm not excited by, that are not challenging, and therefore typically also have the lower price.
So, Nick, you mentioned in your past life being an employee. You now run this company. Do you have like, I guess, what have you learned from being a leader and a manager?
So there's a few things that I've learned. I've learned that being good at one thing does not mean being good at running a business doesn't mean that you're good at being a manager. Um, and that's something that I've spent a lot of time the last 2 years really, really digging my trying to improve on. The other thing that I learned is that literally your job is never done. And I'm not talking about answering emails. I'm talking about innovating and making sure that the projects that you're working on are always new and cutting edge. So one of the things with Nikki Digital, and I think we touched on this earlier, is that that business was all about staying relevant. And that meant knowing the coolest music, knowing the coolest places, stopping going places you like because they were quote unquote not cool anymore. And like all of these things that when you run a business, you don't realize that you're inadvertently doing. And it's really just like kind of keeping up with the times, right? So with OutSnapped, I've been very conscious about, as opposed to the one step forward, two steps backwards, I've been really trying to get to two steps forward, one step backwards. And I think that's something like you just have to keep an eye on of like, you have to be working on today, but you also have to really think about tomorrow and next year and the 5 year and like where you're going. So did that answer your question?
Yeah, I feel like when you become a leader or manager of your own team, you kind of reflect back on how you were as an employee,
Oh
or
yeah.
you sympathize more with your prior managers, I guess.
Yes.
But
Yeah.
it's interesting that you touched on balancing the short term versus the long term. I think that's something that everyone has to. That's like a balancing act that everyone deals with. If you take us back to like the beginning of 2020, and the prime of OutSnapped, can you give us a sense of like what does the CEO do? Like, what do you do on a daily basis?
I don't really like the term CEO for myself because we're not like a huge company where I have a defined role as the CEO, where I'm like, in a nice office with a corner office with windows everywhere. I have a full team under me executing my whims. It's not like that. I'm in the thick of it. And this goes back to what we were talking about with the managerial stuff. One of the things that's been really difficult for me is I see myself as in the trenches with everyone else because that's what it feels like, but everyone else in the team looks at me like I am their boss, which makes perfect sense, right? And therefore I am somehow above them, which is not how I operate in work or in life. And so that's something with in terms of company culture that I've really struggled with is like, how do you let your staff know that they can come to you with anything, but then also retain the power to actually be their boss? So when you tell them to do or not do something, it's not a question. It's a task that's given, right? So I think that's something that's like really, really tricky for me is because like I said, I still feel like I'm not a boss, right? I still feel like I'm going to play every day, right? Like I'm going to work and I have emails I have to respond to and I have bills I have to pay and accounting, but I also get to play every day, right? I get to like make cool things every day and I get to talk to customers every day. Like I had a customer call last night and it was my last call of the day, so I didn't have a rush. And it was this person that, randomly came via an inbound campaign we have running. And he was such a nice guy that we ended up chatting for an hour and a half. And like I got to hear all about this line of business that I knew nothing about. And he had worked in the event world for a while. And, we realized that there's no way we hadn't been in the same room multiple times and we just didn't know each other. And like that to me is what running a business is, right? Like the ability to make my own decisions about where and how I should invest my time. And that's what goes again is tricky when you have a staff where you're saying the same thing like, no, 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 you're just like me, except you have to do these things when I say you have to do them, as opposed to getting to make your own schedule like I do, right? And like I think just going back to like what I said is every day I feel like I'm getting to play. Of course, I have chores, just like when you're growing up and you got to do the laundry, or just like your adult life when you're growing up and you got to do laundry. But the thing that keeps me going and the things that make all those other things that no one ever wants to do worth doing is the fact that I really truly feel like I get to play all day. And that's something that's been tough this year as I was reinventing business, right? Like I went from really having an idea and a 5-year plan of where I wanted to go and what I was excited to play with. And, we had to scrap all of that. And along with scrapping that, we had made major investments in our 1, 2, and 5-year plan in January of this year. Like we were all at PBX. Well, I guess this is not a podcast, a photo booth center podcast, but PBX is the international interactive photo and video conference that takes place in Vegas every year, where people who work in the interactive photo industry gather. And that was literally the week before everything shut down. So I was out there making deals with our vendors who we, license software from, who we work with, who we collaborate with, vendors who make products that you never think of, like, ink cartridges that we get. And we had, like I said, made major investments in our 2020, 2021, and 2025 year plan. And literally on March 11th, everything just came to a grinding halt. And if you think it's a lot of work to run events, it's surprisingly a lot of work to cancel events too. So like, we canceled over 200 events or postponed 200 events in a 3-day period. And I shouldn't say we canceled. Our clients came to us and needed to cancel or postpone.
That's bonkers.
Um,
Like 300 events in a 3-day period. Is that what you just
two,
said, right?
200,
200.
200
Okay.
ish. Yeah. Yeah.
That's
You
crazy.
know, and what's crazier is that literally here we are several months later and our calendar for next year does not have one in-person event, right? We have a few weddings, a few like, direct to consumer stuff, but our corporate planners, not a single person is planning an in-person event for 2021 right now. We have had a few righteous people who have said it's easier to go from virtual to real life, so we're going to do it that way. But literally, that's 1% of the planners that we're talking.
Okay, so I'm glad you started talking about the pandemic. So I guess this is I was
It's your
trying to think
favorite
back.
subject.
Yeah, this this was this was when we started talking a lot more. So that was one of the I guess benefit. I don't want to say there's any benefit of a pandemic, but that was one of the silver linings is
Silver
that we were
linings, yeah.
yeah speaking a lot more. And I was trying to think back to our conversations. But before we get into a couple things that stood out to me, I guess let me ask you. You mentioned all the cancellations and a very stressful time. The business is turned upside down. How do you think you reacted, or what did you do?
That's a good question. I mean, I think one of the things that sets an entrepreneur aside, and I don't like titles like entrepreneur. I think one of the things that sets me and people like me aside is that it's very rare that I finish a project and say, "Oh, I did that perfectly. Like that could not have gone better." Right? Anytime I do anything, my first thing to do is find the places that we could have done better, whether that's efficiencies in work or literally like oh, we cropped these slightly wrong, or oh my god, this logo is slightly off center and it was supposed to be centered. Like it's that constant, like when you finish an event, in my opinion, it's not done until you have quality controlled it, made sure everything was as close to perfect as possible. And when things aren't perfect, you own them with your clients immediately so they know that you are aware and care, and you make good on them, right? So I think the way this relates to COVID is like, yes, we have somehow managed to pull ourselves out of the what we thought was impending doom. and have a very successful year. And I think we could have been more successful. I think we could have been less successful. I don't know how to say it. It's like the things, you and I talk almost every day since March, which is like, it is a fun silver lining. And you've gotten to see a lot of our problem solving. And there were days where I know I was just hitting my head against the wall trying to figure out and iterate. And there are days that you were doing the same. And then we had our little victories along the way. And slowly it really kind of emerged for both of us, what we wanted to do. And I think one of the things to me that was really interesting about the beginning of the pandemic was, for the first time, at least in my life, every single person that I interacted with, whether I knew them well or not, or whether they were the same like demographic as me, same city, same place, everybody was paralyzed in the same way. Every single person was in the exact same position for a small period of time. And I've never felt that. I've never felt it was like oddly a weird unification, but around such a terrible thing. And then as we got into like, week 2, 3, 4, or 5, you started to see the people separate out again. And I always use, like, when people ask me how my friends are from college, I'm like, oh, they're exactly the same. Like, the kids who are really productive are being really productive. The kids who sat on the couch and smoked pot are still sitting on the couch and smoking pot, right? Like, that's what we started to see again when the smoke cleared, right? Like, the people in my network who are constantly doing things that I think are really cool and awesome iterated and figured it out. And the people who don't have that skill set, and this goes back to creativity, which we talked about earlier, like, people think of creativity as pulling out your Bob Ross canvas and painting happy little trees, but creativity is figuring out how to get yourself out of a hole, right? And I also talked earlier about how I hate picking up the phone and asking people for help or for business. But when push comes to shove and you literally have no choice, that's when you literally have no choice. You have to figure out how to turn, water into wine. That's what we did.
That's so fascinating the way you described it, that some people, like the people that are creative and iterate, that's who they are, and they find a way to do that no matter what the circumstances are. Um,
Right.
and that's kind of that's who I'm appealing to with this podcast, with Bound to be Rich, is people who feel different, people who feel
Whoa,
that they're bound to.
name reveal. I didn't know
Yeah.
the name until just now.
Oh, I didn't tell you the name before. There you go.
No, but
Live.
now I'm excited. I've always wanted to be rich, so this is news to me.
There's a couple things that I remember you saying in our conversations, and obviously this journey is not always a clean journey, right? It was a really messy period getting from there to where you are now. And it was really fascinating to see the growth from me.
Right, and it's still messy. Like, we present like it's not messy, and I'm sure this is similar for you. Like, it's all about presenting the fake it till you make it, right? Like, that phrase exists for a reason, right? It's because it exists in reality. People are on a regular basis faking it till they make it, right?
One comment that I remember you making in that time was, no matter, like, it was a very uncertain period, right? And even in that uncertainty, um, where a lot of people were considering other careers and getting a job and whatever, you made a comment to me that something along the lines like, "I just can't go back to being an employee." I don't know if you remember that, but can you elaborate on that mindset a little bit?
Yeah. So I've had obviously a pretty long journey, and there's a lot of things that have gone into this sort of like mindset that I've built. And one of those things was like coming out of the gate being accidentally fairly successful compared to my peer group. And just, what at the time felt like accidents falling into good opportunities, which I now realize was me seeing opportunity and seizing them, which is what I think of when we talk about creativity again. Um, and one of those things was, like, I accidentally at the time started this very successful website, which gave me foray into a lot of the things we talked about earlier, and has really informed and paved the way for me in the rest of my life. um, I made what I call at the time a mistake of saving money because I was literally working too much to spend it. And that cushion has also provided me the ability to take risks and be successful throughout the rest of life, right? So there's a lot of things that growing up felt like happy accidents to me. And maybe they were, but I've definitely learned from them, and they are how I now present and create new opportunities. So moving to 2015, 16, when it was becoming clear to me that I was no longer enjoying my last business, Nikki Digital, the way that I had and the way that I was passionate about, and that particular business was not something I could continue if I wasn't actively passionate about it, because it required so much energy and so much schmoozing and so much. The one thing I keep coming back to is relevance. Like, you just had to be, I had to be the coolest teenager every single day of my life because teenagers were my audience. And as a 30-plus-year-old person, that was starting to feel very uncool and weird. And like, I wanted to figure out my next. And so part of what I thought my next move would be, and this is something that, other people who work in ad agencies and marketing agencies were always like, oh man, just like start applying and you'll get some like cushy creative director position somewhere. And I actually knew people who had done things like this. And so I was like, okay, that's not like super out of the realm of like, get a cushy position, show up every day and do my thing, and then go home and have my life. And when I started meeting with headhunters, I had been out of the corporate world for so long that I literally at that point, like last time I was in the corporate world, the internet barely existed, right? And so fast forward to now, you have all these positions, HR is called like head of employee experience, right? Like, I didn't know what the job titles. So I went to the headhunter and was like, look, I can do anything, right? Like, I've run my own business for 10 plus years. I've worked in marketing, I've worked in advertising, I've worked with clients like this, I've solved these problems. I've had staff under me. I'm prepared to do pretty much anything that will make me this salary point that I. And the headhunter was just like, it doesn't work that way. And I was like, I understand that it doesn't work that way, but I need you to work with me. Like, you're going to make a big hunk of change off of me landing this cushy position that everyone keeps telling me that's going to be no problem for me to get. And literally, I couldn't find a headhunter who would work with me because my career had been so undefined that they didn't know what to do with me.
You didn't fit in a box.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
then so I started like looking at job descriptions and even like kind of like reaching out to HR people and putting myself on the radar of some folks. And I literally couldn't get through the HR door, right? Like, and to me that was really scary. Like, here I am, I'm in my mid 30s. I've had a very successful career thus far. I want to make sort of a shift. I can't even get an entry level position because they look at my resume and they say, you're too qualified for this. I can't get a position that I think I would be great at because they say, what, you haven't worked somewhere for 10 years? And you're like, well, I ran my own business, right? And it was really kind of a scary thing. And so the opportunities that were presenting themselves at the time were just not that exciting to me. And I couldn't imagine giving up all the freedoms you get for working for yourself to go and do a job that I didn't want to do, right? And which there's a it's not really a saying, but there's a thing that I always do, and it sounds really dumb, but if you ever think you've made a decision, bet on it and see how you feel if you win or lose. Like, I'll flip a coin on something and be like, heads is the decision, like I'll get a job. And if it lands on heads and you feel like, crap, I really didn't want that to land that way. Like, it's this weird internal thing that happens where you think you've made a decision, but then your gut kicks in when the bet happens and the results come in. So that's actually something that I do more often than I'd like to admit.
I was gonna say one other thing, that you had said, and I love this because so back in that period with all the uncertainty, everyone was like whining about the government and and rightfully so, like people needed help, right? But
Yeah.
there was one thing that you said that still sticks with me because I just love this, where you basically said something along the lines of, you know what? I'm going to be my own stimulus. And I'd love to hear you elaborate a little bit on that mindset.
Yeah, I mean, this I think goes back to what I was like saying a minute ago about how for the first time in my life everybody was in the same position. So for a moment I really felt like I was like everyone else and everyone else was like me. And as I fought with the government for the things that all of us were supposed to get, and it became a full-time job to figure out why my health insurance got canceled incorrectly, figure out why I wasn't getting unemployment that I was supposed to be getting. I just got to a certain point where I was like, I'm literally spending 40 hours a week trying to get the government to do the things that they have promised us. And even if that happens, it's barely enough money to live on, right? So why am I spending 40 hours a week on this when I could be doing what I do every other day of my life, which is spend my time figuring out how to be successful. And I use that word because I think other people relate to it because it means different things to people. But I spend my time trying to be excited about what I'm working on, right? And also pay the bills.
Yeah, but if I remember back to this period, when you said that, it was like a switch turned on because after you had this mindset shift, I remember you just put your head down and you were working nonstop on ideas. So it just to me stood out because there's a little bit of confidence in that where I guess it comes from all the experience you've had working on your own, where you have this confidence. Hey, I can figure this out and I can be my own stimulus. A lot of people didn't have that.
I would love to say it was confidence, it was desperation, right? And that goes back to the exact same thing about what I was saying about like I will never pick up the phone if I don't need to call, call and ask for something. So if I've ever called you and asked you for something, that means I really needed it. So if you didn't say yes, that it was, I guess, a mindset shift for me. And the best way I can explain it was just realizing that this was, it felt different, but it was no different than any other day of my professional life, right? Like wake up in the morning and figure it out. Wake up in the morning. How can I be excited and also pay my rent and make, right? Like, and I think that is something back to your last question that I didn't feel like I would have the opportunity to do when or if I took a job with someone else. The other thing that happened, I believe it was around that same time period, I I had an opportunity to land in my lap that was interesting enough to me, and I think it would have actually been a really cool experience to a part of a job that I've always worked around, but never actually specifically had that role. And that was the role of a photo editor, and not editing in Photoshop, but literally having clients. It was at a photo agency. Clients come in and say, "Hey, we're looking for content that looks like XYZ." This particular agency was really interesting because they were working primarily with user generated content prior to COVID. And then when COVID hit, they got busier than ever because the creatives that most ad agencies went to literally couldn't create content, right? So they had to go through these pools of user generated content. So the role was essentially getting, you wake up in the morning and you're like, hey, we need photos of X, Y, and Z. And then the day would be spent searching the internet for user generated content on Instagram, Facebook, YouTube. And so it's like a world that I live in, and we create content just like that for our clients. But the position literally paid at 40 hours a week less than unemployment. And to me, it wasn't about why would I work for less than unemployment. It wasn't about that, which I think, we heard a lot about on the news. Like no one's trying to get jobs because jobs pay less than unemployment. For me, it was taking this position doesn't provide more of a safety net than unemployment does. And if I take this position, I can't figure out my next step because that's what it's taking away from. And so I didn't even end up getting unemployment for 90% of the time I was unemployed. I don't know about the rest of the people on this, but as a self-employed person, it was very difficult to get the things that we were promised. But it just for me felt like I was already in a hole. It was better to make that particular hole a little bit deeper because I knew that once I dug up the right idea, I'd be able to get myself out of it.
And you kind of talked about put like you and I both were trying different things during this period, trying to figure out what to do, and that could be a whole podcast of itself. But I remember, I don't know if I remember this correctly, but we were talking about what is our passion, what do we want to do, and you said something along the lines, and please correct me if I'm off here, but I think it was something about you're passionate about translating in-person experiences or events into a digital experience. Is that right, or am I off there?
Yeah, I don't recall the conversation, but that does make sense because a lot of what I've always done is really play on that line of in person and digital, right? And that's one of the things that kind of springboarded me in the very beginning is that I was able to take things from real life and put them on the internet before other people could figure out how to. And that's always a line that I found really interesting. Like what is and now even more so, like what is real life and what is internet life, right? Like a great example of that is like you look at someone's Instagram account and it presents as real life, but it's a very, very specifically curated version of that person's life for better or worse, you know? And I think playing in that sandbox that goes back and forth, it's like, a portal from real life to the internet and the way we create things. And like as a photographer, and that's kind of, when people say, what do you do? I typically will say I'm a photographer. And then my friends around me will be like, why don't you tell them what you really do? And I'm like, I don't know. That's what I do. I take photos. And they're like, no, but you run a company. And I'm like, oh, yeah, that. And to me, that's always been interesting because being a photographer creates a lens for the way you see the world, right? And one of the things that has intrigued me about photography when it comes to we'll call it, for lack of a better term, my day job versus the things that I like to photograph. When I photograph for myself, which I don't do enough of anymore, I'm photographing the things in life that stand out to me and why they're different from the things around them, right? And that's constantly what I've always been doing. And one of the reasons as a street photographer I love New York City is because maybe not so much during COVID, but you would see an equation in a busy area and say, okay, I need a man with a blue hat to walk by to finish this equation that I see right now. And if you're in Midtown, that's like a 3 minute wait. Like the dude that you need is just going to walk by. The same way that the vendors in Times Square make oodles of money every day because they literally have millions of people walking by them every day. And one of them needs a graffitied baseball cap, right? Or more than one of them, lots of them need, right? And it's when it comes to the experiences that we create for OutSnap versus what I did with Nikki Digital. Nikki Digital was about finding those beautiful moments and showcasing them. And one of the other things that I stopped liking about Nikki Digital towards the end is people. There's everyone wanted to look and feel like everybody else. So those wallflower moments where I saw something really special were harder to find because people were all trying to be more so like they would see my camera and pose for me as opposed to me seeing someone taking a photo and interact. So when it comes to OutSnap, we ironically create repeatable experiences over and over and over again, right? So with a photo booth, it's all about creating an environment and taking someone, anyone, and putting them in it and creating an experience that's as close to the last person and the person after them again. And that's why looking at a gallery of photo booth images is not usually that fun unless you really know everyone in photos because their personalities stand out to you. Whereas if I photograph a party, even if it's a really boring party, people will look at every single photo from.
So after, I guess, that whole messy middle of trying to figure things out, you found something that lined up with this passion of yours, of going digital, right? And I think I would love to have you, I guess, talk a little bit about this topic that you're doing really well with right now of virtual booths. And before I hand it off to you, I just want to say that I know that you are the king of virtual in the industry because I'd like to say that I'm pretty intimately familiar with a lot of the top players globally. And from what I know, I don't think anyone does it better than you. So I would love to hear how that's going because I'm sure a lot of people are listening from that industry. Some people were skeptical about the potential of virtual booths. Some people didn't get
Yeah.
it when I explain it to people that are not in the industry. They're like, I can just do this on Snapchat. I don't get it. So if you can riff a little bit about the virtual component and how well you're doing it with it right now, that'd be awesome.
Yeah. So I am the first to admit, and you and I had several of these conversations at the beginning. People were coming to us, my clients, and also the vendors that you and I both know well and work with were coming to us and pitching us on this idea of the virtual photo booth. And I remember you and I got off the phone with another third party and like kind of had a sidebar and we're like, that is a stupid idea. Like this has no legs. And we both felt that way. And one of the things that I thought was really interesting was how I started to see it being a successful tool. And it took a much longer time for you to get on board with it. And you were open to it because you saw I was making cool things, but much like me, I just didn't think people would interact with it. And one of the things that allowed me to kind of pull out in front of the curve was the fact that I was looking at the future. And when everything, when my clients who had canceled in-person events started reaching out to me and being like, hey, we're starting to put this back together, we're going to go virtual this year, like, is there such a thing as a virtual photo booth? And I was like, I mean, yeah, kind of, like we could do it. And kind of like very begrudgingly did a few of these events because I didn't think I had a choice and I didn't really believe in it. And prior to COVID, I was very lucky that the sales that I did never felt like sales because someone had typically gotten our name. They would call us up about a wacky project, and were already warm lead. They were already wanted to buy by the time we got on the phone with them, and it really just came down to like timing and budget. And they knew that we could do what they wanted, and they knew that we could help them iterate and make their idea better. So when I started having to do sales for the virtual photo booth, I for the first month of it didn't believe in it, and I was like taking phone calls with literally anyone who I could get on the phone with and pitching them on this thing that I didn't believe in. So going back to fake it till you make it, right? And then when we started seeing some of the user generated content, we did the Norton Antivirus Global Summit, which for anyone who doesn't work in the corporate world, like you typically have a yearly all hands, and very few of them to date have done it virtually. One of the cool things is, all the people from all the different offices will converge upon a city, typically a Las Vegas or an Atlantic city, a convention center city, Chicago, and they will have some sort of big hands-on meeting, all hands on deck meeting, and then there'll be some, exciting party, and it's serves two purposes. One, to kick off the sales year, right? Get people excited. Two, to network with the people that you work with on a regular basis, but maybe work on the other side of the world with. And three, for a lot of these people to have a fun, exciting time outside of the household, right? So a lot of these people they may not get to go on vacation every year. So this is partial vacation, partial work, right? And what a lot of these companies started realizing was that they weren't going to be able to do it this year. So a lot of our early calls were with these folks who are doing these big 2,000, 3,000 person international virtual events where all these people were used to going to a place, having a party, and hopping in a photo booth. So when I started seeing some of the content of people from around the world taking photos and smiling and enjoying it and taking multiple photos, I started to really believe in the product. And that for me was like a really key moment. And one of the things that often comes up in my current sales calls, like even the guy I was telling you about that I spoke to yesterday, one of the reasons why we ended up on the phone for so long was because he was like, I got to tell you, I got this email about this product and I just thought it was the stupidest idea ever. And I said, I'm happy to admit to you that when we first started getting requests for it, I also thought it was the stupidest idea ever. And I walked him through the things that changed my opinion about it. And he related because he had just experienced them himself by playing with our tool. So I think I know I've gotten away from the question, but I think that you have to iterate and try things. And what I started to say in the beginning of this is like thinking about the future and the present at the same time. One of the things that I did that allowed me to pull out in front of the rest of the group who were trying these things is as soon as people started reaching out to me about it, I bought a lot of ads on the search terms virtual photo booth, right? And so anyone who Googled virtual photo booth trying to figure out if it existed ended up on outsnapped.com. And this was a time when advertising on the internet was pennies on the normal dollar because literally everyone stopped their ad campaigns in March, April, and May. And so for pennies, I think I was spending $500 a month. And once I ramped up, I was literally on 30 calls a week of people just found me because they searched virtual photo booth. And we built out SEO stuff around it as well. But that little leap that I saw, that 10-minute deep dive into looking and seeing a spike in people searching, that is one of the things that's made this entire year possible. And that's that thinking in the future while, digging yourself out of the present.
Is there anything you'd be willing to share regarding like who some of your clients are, how well this is going compared to, things in the prior years, et cetera? Is there anything that you can paint the picture of how well virtual is going?
It's such a different experience from my side that the success metrics are completely different for me. And you, as someone like you who I've talked to on a regular basis, like there are days when I'm like really psyched we did something cool, and then there are weeks where all I do is complain about the fact that I've been on 35 Zoom calls. Um, so success metrics for me are very different. And going back to that, like waking up and being excited about what I'm doing, like I don't wake up on most days excited to get on Zoom. Like the week of Thanksgiving, which was a 3-day week, I woke up and my calendar app, which is I use Drift, um, I woke up to an email on Monday morning saying, "Congrats, you have 38 meetings booked for this week." And I was like, "Oh wow, that's a lot for this week." And then I realized as I was like pulling into the day that it was a 3-day week, and I normally do 30 to 35 meetings in a 5-day week. And it was the scariest thing that I've faced. It was almost scarier than the beginning of COVID. I was like, I don't know how I'm going to get through this. But in terms of success metrics, like financially, we are somehow going to pull out of this year very close to what we did last year, even without income for 3 months, almost 4 months. So take that for what you will. I'm pretty proud of the fact that we were able to do that. We're working with clients that are really awesome. One of the things that's been interesting for me is that, we have a bunch of now, what I would consider to be dream clients, people that I would have always wanted to work with. And because of that little ditty that I told you about before of just buying those keywords, they all came to me, right? Like we have clients that, like I said, are dream clients that cold called me asking if we could do projects for them without us ever having to like get our foot in the door. These are people that like we had emailed and never our emails never got open, right? So that's my humble way of saying like I'm very very proud of the clients that we're working, and we're getting to do really really fun interactive stuff with um, some TV clients, a lot of, like I said, these household name large corporations that are doing these global summits. And I'm really hoping that a lot of these relationships translate back into hybrid events and then in-person events, right? So this for me, going back to that 1 year, 3 year, 5 year plan, for me, so much of this year and virtual booths for me was initially about the investment of getting people on the phone with me so they could meet me so that when things got back to normal, we could sell them in-person experience. I really didn't expect to be creating the level of work that we are. And the complex and interactive stuff. It's really like, I worked on a project last night for a Netflix press junket that's going live on Thursday. And, I was up pretty late working on it, but I was so excited. It was like I felt like a little kid. And I will name drop here. Like I was a kid of the Karate Kid era. So we're doing the virtual photo booths that the press junket is using for the Cobra Kai premiere that comes out, I think, the end of this month. So it's going to be the interactive piece that press is going to use when they premiere this episode. And it's really cool. I got to dissect the key art and make this create like really cool creative interactive experience with people who were my childhood heroes.
That's awesome, and I know of many, many other examples like that, but this is kind of reminding me to quickly touch on something that I find fascinating about your personality. It's unique to you, where you don't like, I don't know how else to say it, but you don't brag. Um, it's interesting because I know many of the largest companies in the industry. I know, like, the most recognizable names, and I speak with them, and they're out there, everybody knows them, but they tell me, "We lose a lot of business to that guy, Nick." And I'm like, "Who's this guy, Nick? Everybody keeps telling me about it." But somehow you're more of a behind the radar, behind the scenes, top performer. And I'm just curious if you could riff quickly on, like, why are you more, I guess, behind the scenes and not really in front of everybody about it?
I don't I don't see a reason to be in front of everybody about it. Right? It's like what and this goes back to success metrics. Like what are the things that make you happy? And sometimes making other people feel like I'm like choosing my words very wisely here because I don't know what goes on in other people's minds. For me, I don't need other people's approval to or admiration to feel like I've had a successful day. For me, I feel successful when I go to bed at night, just like that experience I just shared with you of being like, that was so cool. I just worked with this project that was like a childhood like hero of mine, right? Like these are kids, like that particular project. Like when I was a kid, Karate Kid was like the coolest thing you could possibly be, right? Who didn't say wax on, wax off way too many times, like all the stuff, right? So for me, what do I need someone else to know about that, right? Like it just to me that isn't a success metric. Like
Yeah, yeah. I guess I would just kinda say for people listening that I would describe you as the needle in the haystack because you are probably, I can't think of, I'll say it this way, I can't think of anyone else that is as successful as you that people don't really know. So that speaks a lot to your personality and what you value, and it's also why I find it such a huge win to have convinced you to create a course teaching other people about the virtual booth business. Because I know, given my role in the industry, I know there's a lot of people struggling with this, and they see some people doing really well with it, and they're desperate because their business is not doing as many in-person events, and they need to generate income, and they're looking to learn about this, but there's no real good resource for learning about this. And you kind of mentioned a lot of different things where you've been on God knows how many Zoom calls and how many hours you spend pitching this. You've built a lot of cool different things. So I thought if I wanted to orchestrate a course around this, you were the best person to do that because you had the experience building some of the best virtual experiences that I've seen, but you also had the experience of selling it. And I think that component is what people really want to learn and understand. So if you could talk a little bit about the program you put together, I think people would really be interested.
Yeah, I don't know when this podcast is going to drop in relation to it, but one of the things that I'm really excited about is now the way that you and I have talked about doing sales. So we have sort of an outline of what this program is, and that's going to include obviously the 101 stuff like what is a virtual photo booth and why should it exist? Because I think that's the number one question that people have is why should people pay money for something that's not physical or showing up in real life? To all the different softwares that are available to us that I've played with and the pros and cons with each of those. Um, of course, we'll show you some examples of the work that I can share that is not NDA'd. And I will also, I think you and I talked a little bit about maybe even having some mock sales calls that we can do. And I think what I'm really excited about is that when we send the teaser out for this, we're going to get to hear what other people also want us to add to that course list. Because when you're in the weeds with these things, you don't realize what people need to know. It's like I don't. I recently started working with a salesperson on my team, and it's the first time I've ever worked with a salesperson. And they sat in on a ton of my calls and they asked me a lot of very specific questions about like, why did you say XYZ? And I didn't have a good answer. And then I explained that I had, over the course of talking to 30, 35 people a week, had found that this is what got me the best response, right? So, like, one joke I always have in my cadence is I show people that we can upload a photo, and I upload a photo of Bruce Willis, which I randomly had from something else. And I say, here's a photo of me where I look just like Bruce Willis, and every person laughs. And so instead of just uploading the other photos that were on my desktop to show, I just stuck with Bruce Willis, right? And like these are all things that happen from iteration. And so it's like kind of we all know what the term A/B testing is. We do it. That's what we call learning. That's what we call growing up, right? Like you do something stupid when you're a kid, and you usually realize you shouldn't do it again because it yielded bad results, right? So when I've been on all these sales calls, like as a not salesperson who doesn't know sales tactics, I literally it was like stand-up comedy for me where I was literally like dropping things in, and if they worked, I tried them again. If they didn't work, I modified it and tried it again. So now with my salesperson who's going to help me build out the rest of our sales team, we have this playbook that literally has answers to almost every question that I've been lobbed in the past like 6 or 7 months, going from this is a terrible idea. Why should I spend money on it? To is this possible? And that's a really cool experience that I'm excited to share with people too. And something else that I think that you and I are hoping to do is also have one-on-one calls with people, and maybe even prior to building it, so we can really get an idea of what people want to hear. And I think that to me, like if I got to choose how my education was growing up, that would have been way cooler because I would have definitely asked for things that would be more useful in my life than biochemistry.
I would be terribly surprised if there was anybody on the planet Earth that that was in more pitches for virtual than you. So you definitely have the experience there. For people that are interested, there is a link in the show notes to the course, or you can just go to wisdra.com, WISDRA.com, and check it out. And as Nick mentioned there, there will be the opportunity for students to book private sessions with Nick to go over whatever they want. Those are very limited, so if anybody wants that, you have to act quickly. I think there are a couple questions I'd like to wrap up each episode with, Nick, so I'll just lob them your way and
Sure.
see what we come up with. One thing I'm curious about, because I don't know this, if we zoomed back in time and had the opportunity to see young Nicholas or people around young Nicholas, how would they have described you back then? Were there any hints of a future successful entrepreneur? Anything like that? Bring anything to mind?
I don't brag often, but one thing I will brag about is that if you Google New York Times, Nick Rhodes, magic, rabbit, anything having to do with magic in me, I was a magician when I was a kid, and I thought I was the coolest person in the world. And the other thing that I will also add to that is that I'm really, really happy that for whatever reason, the articles are archived, but the photos of me in tuxedos with various magic props are not archived and available online. So you have to DM me for the photographic evidence. I don't know. I guess like that's a really so magic for me is not something that I'm involved with on a regular basis anymore. And actually, interestingly, at the beginning of the pandemic, I actually repurchased a bunch of magic books that I had as a kid because I wanted to reread about the psychology of magic. And like I said, I don't practice it every day, but I am very much aware of the concept still, like misdirection, right? Like sales is all about misdirection. Someone asks a question and you don't want to answer it, or you don't want them to know something, or like, you know, don't buy this. It's the worst. Buy this thing. It's like it's really all relevant. And also my ability to public speak is directly from that too. My training as being a performer as a kid. I had a coach who helped me and taught me a bunch of things about performing and speaking. One of the things he always said was never show the audience your butt. And in that case, it wasn't because I had a weird butt. It was because as a magician, and I go to Magic Hell for sharing this. A lot of the times you hide things behind you, but it also you don't show the audience a things you don't want them to see, or b things they don't want to see, right? And so that's something that I use on a regular basis. So and also as a kid magician, I wanted more than anything to start a business where I was performing at children's birthday parties. And I did that as a teenager, and my best friend like drove me around because I didn't have my license yet, and so I gave him a cut. And I was making like $50 a weekend, and I thought it was so cool because I was also, a magician. Um, so
I
I guess
assume,
the answer is yes, and I
yeah,
hadn't thought of that.
I assume you felt different then compared to your peers and friends, right?
Yeah, I don't know that I had the wherewithal to like know what or why, and it's like um, there's an example from my childhood that I always use. So my mom works in mental health as a therapist, and people are always like, "Oh, what's it like having a shrink for a mom?" And I don't get into explaining what the difference between a shrink and a therapist is with them, but I do explain it with this one story. Like as a kid, I I hated peanut butter and jelly, right? And as a result, I was the kid with the tuna fish sandwich every day. And because everybody else ate peanut butter and jelly, I either got made fun of or felt different. And something that I always joke about is the conversation with my family wasn't like the reason you have a tuna fish sandwich is because you don't like peanut butter and jelly, and then you'd be upset about that too. It was how does it make you feel? Like why are you upset about this? Like and really unpacking what was different about the situation rather than just being like dismissive of it and saying like you don't like peanut butter and jelly. Do you want to take it? And then be miserable for a different reason, right? Like it was really about understanding why we as humans are all different. So I was aware as a kid that I was different than other people, but I don't think it was until I was much older and even like on a regular basis, you realize the things that make you different. And that's something I touched on a little bit earlier about there was that moment where we were all the same this year,
Mhm.
obviously with exceptions, but then we all started pulling out into our different directions again. And I thought that was, for me, was really eye opening to see the path that I took and the path that other people took. And I mean, when also coming back to mental health, like that was such a rough period for everyone, and everyone had to handle it differently. But one of the things that got me out of that rut and out of that despair feeling was that thing you said a little while ago about me realizing that I've always been my own stimulus package. So why is now any different, right? And that's when I was like, I can do this, right? And I think it I would like to once again say that it was confidence, but it really was just desperation. It was like it wasn't necessarily I can do this, it was I have to.
How much of a role would you say luck has played in your success? You mentioned happy accidents earlier, but I'm curious,
Yeah.
luck versus like ability, hard work, intelligence, stuff like that.
Look, you know, people always say you're in the right place at the right time, but you're never going to be in the right place at the right time if you're not working your butt off to be in the right place at the right time. And I think that happy accidents occur, but it's about having the wherewithal to know and to learn from them. And that goes back to A/B testing too, right? So it's like, oh, I did this and it yielded this result. I did this and it yielded a bad result. Like you have to iterate, right? And it's like you're not going to know that you're in the right place at the right time if you aren't open to being in the right place at the right time. Does that make sense? So I think like luck is a big part of it, but it's also about, and I'm not like a woo woo, like you can manifest your future kind of person, but you got to put yourself in the right place at the right time. It's like playing the lottery, right? Like you aren't going to win the lottery if you don't play the lottery. So if you don't put yourself in a lot of places or try a lot of things, you're not going to have those happy accidents that other people call luck. Luck is also, I think, in this particular case, a word for trial and error.
This is the question I end each episode with. You mentioned how you had different success metrics in regards to business, and we touched on a lot of different things in this conversation. But I'm curious to hear, like clearly, rich life isn't just about money. So, what is a rich life to you?
Wow, that is a whole other 3 hour conversation in and of itself. I think that there's this really funny meme a few weeks ago that I unfortunately related with really well. And like, everyone talks about being asymptomatic with COVID, but there was a meme that had someone who looked so horribly depressed and in despair. And it said, and the caption was, you are very happy. You're just asymptomatic. And I thought that that was like really, really, really funny and dark. But I think that it's about um, the same thing that I'm talking about with going into work every day. Obviously, my commute is from my bedroom to the home office, which is the couch and sometimes a desk. Uh, so I use that term loosely at the moment. But I think it's about also having high levels of engagement in the rest of your life. Something else that happened to me at the beginning of COVID that's really informed, well, this year for everyone, but I think the future of my life is that prior to COVID, was someone who was socializing 5 or 6 nights a week, going out to dinner 5 or 6 nights a week. That's a success metric for me, being able to afford to go out for dinner in New York City, and not worrying about how much it costs because it's not cheap, right? So, but once again, that success metric is about experience for me, right? Like I'm not happy about the money itself. I'm happy about the fact that I can afford to experience good food with good friends on a regular basis. And I think that that goes into that same like I want high levels of engagement all the time with the things that I want to be engaged with. And something that I realized at the beginning of COVID was that I all of a sudden was forced to be self quarantined for, I think there was like times where I would open the door of my apartment and realize I hadn't opened the door for 2 weeks. Like there was weird dark times in there. And a lot of my friends were starting to go really stir crazy. And I had this kind of like rebirth where I had realized that I had not spent any time with myself in years, like for better or for worse. I had not just been alone for a day or 2 days, 3 days, other than being like sick. That's the only time I'd be at home and in bed and, rebuilding. But I had like a good month and a half of solitude, and everyone was like my family was very nervous for me, but it was actually a really incredible experience for me because I got to really spend time with myself, think, and a lot of the thinking was just about how the state of the world and what the hell was I going to do, but I also had time to reflect and like read. I read more in the first month than I have in years, and really got to sort of like rebirth my brain and have the ability to decide what I want when I go back to quote unquote normal. And I think like, yes, I still really love socializing. So that will be a big part of it. But I also will now know going back that I need to create alone time for myself to really rest mentally, physically, and figure out what I want next steps.
What a fantastic and thought-provoking conversation, Nick. I definitely love the specific example of like going out to dinner with friends. I think a lot of times when you ask that question, people stick to very generic things. So it's helpful to have a specific example to tie those things to. But
Yeah,
thanks so much for coming on the show, Nick. I enjoyed the conversation, and I'm sure people listening will as well.
sounds good. I look forward to talking to you again very soon. Let's figure out another way for me to hop back on for another episode.
Maybe around two. Let's see. All right, Nick.
Sounds
Thanks
good.
so much. Talk
Okay.
to you soon, man.
Yep, my pleasure.
And there you have it. If you enjoyed this episode, please remember to leave a review. I may even give you a shout out and read yours out on the show. For any and all resources that we discussed, check out the show notes or head on over to boundtoberich.com. Until next time.